This week's episode 8, People Over Politics. I am the host, Martin Mitchell, and today we have a very special guest, Judge Katie O'Malley. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Martin. I'm really happy to be here.
Yes, of course. And of course, there might be some people who don't know about you. Of course, you're a dynamic public figure. So tell the people a little bit something about you. Give us your elevator.
All right. Thanks, Martin. Thanks for saying I'm dynamic. That's really impressive and sweet of you. So I've been a judge for the past 20 years in the District Court of Maryland. And prior to that, I was an assistant state's attorney for 10 years. So, I tried hundreds of cases in front of judges and jurors and advocating for victims of all types of crimes, from petty theft to domestic violence to, sadly, many homicides. I worked with our specialty courts as a judge for the past 20 years, doing a lot of diversion work when it came to drug treatment, mental health issues, veterans treatment. And we also had a court for homeless people, which we now call Court for Homelessness. So we've done, and I've done as a judge for the past 20 years, a lot of work in helping and heal people when they got into the criminal justice system. But also as a judge, I didn't handle just criminal cases. I handled thousands and thousands of cases involving civil disputes, landlord-tenant issues, housing violations where, people were living in horrible conditions and they needed, had filed suits so that they could go after either the landlord and or the individual who, was supposed to be registered as the management of the property. So it's been a great career. And again, for 30 years, I've been advocating for people in our court system, finding solutions for real people who have had real problems. And what I've learned from going to court for fighting for justice day in and day out makes me a really strong and effective attorney general on day one, because attorney generals go to court. That's what they do. The assistants day in and day out are going to the district court, the circuit court, and the appellate courts, and even the Supreme Court of the United States. And I know that because I've had them appear before me many times on cases involving things like wage theft, for labor violations. I've had them come in for housing issues. I've had them come in on environmental crimes that have affected the citizens of the state. And they're hardworking lawyers that need a leader that's actually been there trying cases. When I left the state's attorney's office, I was head of the white collar crime unit. I managed detectives and lawyers resolving white collar crime and economic fraud cases. And, I have to tell you, I learned a lot about managing those cases and helping to build those cases with the investigators from the ground level. And that's the kind of attorney general Maryland needs. Not someone that's just been a lawyer, but someone that's actually been in the courtrooms fighting and advocating for Marylanders day in and day out.
Okay. Well, you gave us a little bit more than an elevator, but I do appreciate it because you gave me somewhere to start. So I know you mentioned wage theft, right?
Mm-hmm.
As one of the cases you were interested in and you definitely tried before. So what are your opinions on wage theft, and how will the AG's office, or how can the AG's office address wage theft in the state of Maryland?
Well, it comes with these quarterly roundtables that the Attorney General right now has set up, but it also comes with having a hotline for people to report the wage theft. Oftentimes, Martin, these are victims that are vulnerable because they have to really rely on their employer. And if they are a whistleblower, they will lose their job. So, what I proposed when I was talking months ago about labor and labor issues is that we have a workers' protection unit full time. So it's not just waiting for the quarterly meetings to sit down and talk to the different unions and heads of these unions, but to have a workers' protection unit where there can be an attorney general, an assistant that works on those cases and those complaints on a daily basis, and then forms the needed investigation to go in and beyond, just the reporting. Because I think if you wait too long to report those cases, the evidence goes away. So it's really important to have a unit that is set up and designated just to dealing with those types of crimes as they occur throughout the state with all kinds of different employers, union and non-union.
And that is important. I would agree with you. And so the next thing I would ask you is, initially, of course, the AG, the way that I look at it is it's a position, that isn't at the forefront for the most part, but it is important. So for some people, who don't understand what the AG does, how would you put it in most layman terms?
Thanks, Martin. It is the chief legal officer for the entire state. So the Attorney General, like I said, is the chief legal officer that attorney generals go to court day in and day out, fighting for Marylanders and fighting for Maryland's interests. The Attorney General also represents all the state agencies and has to give legal advice to each department, whether it's the Department of Environment, the Department of Transportation, Motor Vehicles Administration. So you have over 400 lawyers that are working in a variety of different units. There's 19 special different units. And the big areas that affect people's day in and day out lives that they can really relate to when you talk about the office are consumer protection, environmental crimes, and then organized crime unit and public safety. So those three areas are probably one of the most busiest, those are the busiest units in the office, where you have lawyers day in and day out advocating for Marylanders when it comes to environmental justice, when it comes to consumer protection, economic justice, and when it comes to criminal justice and criminal justice reform. So those are three main areas that the Attorney General works on day in and day out. And it's, also the Attorney General gets to, during the legislative session, ask the legislators to sponsor bills with the AG that are for public safety, like banning ghost guns, or whether the Attorney General is advocating for, being able to sue fossil fuel companies for the climate change damage that they've caused. So for 90 days, the AG sort of works as a lobbyist, lobbying good things, good legislation in the legislature. But 365 days of the year, the Attorney General is going to court.
And one of the things, me as a city council person, one of the things I think I remember most recently is a lawsuit against opioid manufacturers, and I believe the city joined the lawsuit, so they're going to be getting money, like a lot of other cities. So I know that's one of the recent lawsuits.
Right, that was multi-state. That was joined in, right? So AG Frosch joined in with other states, because across our country, we all know of families, if not within our own family, where people's lives have been lost as a result of the opioid crisis, especially during the pandemic. And one of the things I'm most proud about that I did as a judge was sit in drug treatment court, working with folks that came into my courtroom that really just didn't need to be in jail. They needed treatment. And for those 3 years, I worked with substance abuse services and mental health services to get these individuals the treatment they needed, to give them the structure that they needed to stay clean and sober. And it was one of the most rewarding parts of being a judge, because we would have graduation ceremonies twice a year for all of the clients that would come in and have a graduation ceremony with their families, and then we could expunge their records. So it was really a great thing.
I love to hear about expungements, giving people freedom on paper, because we know a lot of times, after going through the penal system, sometimes we're treated as a second-class citizen, even they're after free. So
especially for employment, Martin. I mean, some of the dumbest things were on people's records that aren't even illegal anymore. So I was really proud a few years ago. The Maryland legislature was able to get a lot of great expungement laws put on the books. And I have to tell you, every day I would sign hundreds and hundreds of expungement papers, because great services across the state, especially legal aid, would file on behalf of people that would come in for free, so they could get their records expunged, and they could then go forward getting a job and not having to answer for something that happened 20 years ago. Yes.
And I think I remember seeing you on a panel I was on in Annapolis recently. Did you testify on one of the cannabis bills?
Yes. Chairman Clippinger's bill.
Okay,
I have to tell you,
so I definitely.
Yeah, I'm so happy. I'm happy that is being presented, and hopefully this session, it will go through and become part of the referendum, because, I talked to Mayor Scott, who I think is doing a really great job in Baltimore City, and we've sat down and talked about crime and ways to approach, saving people's lives in our city from gun violence. And one of the major things he and I both agreed on is that so many people are losing their lives over the illegal sale of marijuana. Yet I can't tell you how many sad search warrants I've signed for murder cases where the scenario of the shooting happened and the murder over the sale of marijuana. And if we can just take that out of the picture, I think we could solve a lot of violence. And then, some of the opponents say, well, they're just going to rob the marijuana stores. And I said, well, they rob 7-Elevens and we don't shut them down. People get robbed and so you can't use that as an excuse.
That's a fear tactic. That's a fear tactic in a sense. And I'll be fair with you. I'm a cannabis advocate. So I'm happy to see, cannabis bills move forward, especially the referendum, letting the people decide. But I will say that, I'm not happy with 837 because, I did have amendments for the bill. I was favorable with amendments. A lot of those amendments still are still not being taken into consideration because I think even thinking of one of it was the possession, which was 1.5 ounces, right?
That's a lot of marijuana.
Sure, but I can take 2 ounces on a vacation for personal use.
Right.
Does that mean I'm distributing?
No, but Martin,
that's just one point.
Well, I can tell you right now, that wouldn't even be charged in Baltimore City, but more than likely, because it's not happening as a charge in Baltimore City. But that's a phase-in period so that we can allow for the referendum, as I understood the bill. That's not going to be the permanent part of the bill. Once it's passed, it's passed.
I do understand that. But my problem is I feel like we have to get it right in the forefront and not and like the thought is like there's some components of the bill that in which we like, right? And there's some components of the bill in which we don't like. I think that 2 plants is not a lot. Especially from like a medical perspective, right? From a medical perspective, 2 plants is definitely not a lot.
So, but what is the civil? Because it's not criminalized. The 1.5 ounces would be a civil penalty of like $100, something like that. It doesn't. It's still decriminalized, and marijuana has been decriminalized, and so it wouldn't allow any arrest. So you could have 5 ounces, and that's still not going to be an arrest, and unless at all.
I think it moved to a misdemeanor. like that, from my understanding.
So that's just, however, until the referendum passes, I think, as well as looking at the
the phase in until the
right.
Yes, that is correct. You're 100% right. You're 100% right. But I mean, I even think Jill Carter's bill goes further because I like the fact of vacation of these charges. And I heard in the hearing that the only charges that would be up for expungement are just cannabis. Just solely cannabis charges, like ones that so essentially if it was, I forget how you would classify it, but when you're charged with multiple things, so like those wouldn't be considered. Those wouldn't be considered under this legislation.
Well, if you're charged with possession of some bit of marijuana, but you're also charged with murder, the murder is going to go forward. The possession of marijuana wouldn't. So sometimes people are charged not simply with the possession, but other serious crimes. And I say murder, that's the most extreme. But, say, distribution with a gun, other things that heighten it up. So just the simple possession goes away, but any of those other crimes against persons or public safety would remain.
Yes. And I almost cringe sometimes when we talk about the extreme and murder is always the extreme. Right. So like, even my conversations with, State's Attorney Scott Schellenberger, like a lot of times, I told him he only mentioned a few different crimes, in an hours long conversation. And the reason he mentioned those crimes is because it was a tactic to, make people more fearful and to think like, okay, yes, we do need to be, strong on law enforcement and, strong for the police. You kind of understand where I'm going there. You definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a prosecutor, and in part of the Attorney General's office, you do have prosecution. But I've found as being a prosecutor for 10 years and then a judge for 20 years, there's a balance to all of it. And I gotta tell you, Martin, as a judge sitting once in Baltimore City, I had a whole trial, and it was over possession of cocaine. And I found, I won't give you the whole boring details of it, but I found that 2 detectives who had sworn to tell the truth, they held up their hand, lied under oath. And I couldn't believe it. I was so upset because I'd never made a finding like that in my entire career. Although I'm sure it's happened, but I mean, it was so blatant that I had to, I acquitted the defendant, and I then made a phone call immediately to the Internal Investigations Division to report it, because I had to. I mean, that was ethically, I needed to do that. And nothing ever happened with that report. Nothing happened at all. I never got a phone back. I never got a letter in the mail. I never got an email. 2 years later, those detectives were then involved in some other sort of investigation and then finally got removed from the force. But, I thought, here I am, a sitting judge, and I'm making a report. Not that I'm any better than any regular citizen, but if a sitting judge makes a report and says, I believe these two officers lied under oath, I should find out something. So it just made me realize how difficult it must be for a regular, citizen to make a report to say that something happened that was unethical or illegal with their interaction with the police. So I am a huge advocate for more accountability and transparency in policing, because I have to tell you, I think a majority of the men and women who join the police force do so with the best intentions, and they go to work day in and day out. They're risking their lives to keep our community safe. And I truly believe that the majority of law enforcement is like that. But there are those, and law enforcement will tell you, they know bad apples that are in the force. And we need to make sure that they are taken out swiftly and promptly so that they don't do further damage to the community and further violence in the community. So that's one of the key things that I talk about in my campaign. I was the only candidate to release a criminal justice reform policy within weeks of after entering this race. So it's something that's near and dear to me, again, because of all my experiences.
And speaking of that, are you a proponent or in favor of mobile crisis units? And
no,
is that something that you would champion?
Yes, and I think the model that we need to use when it comes to the mobile crisis unit is the model that they started years back in Anne Arundel County. They have one of the best in the state, probably East Coast. So I am definitely in favor of that, because so many individuals are suffering from mental health crises. And I know from sitting in court and actually going to the commissioner's office at 3 a.m. sometimes to help a loved one sign out an involuntary an involuntary commitment, because that's part of what we do when we're on duty. And I can't tell you over the 20 years how many times I have gone into the commissioner's office after hours and heard from loved ones who needed to have their family member committed because of a mental health illness. And they were afraid not only that that person was going to hurt themselves, but that they might be harmed because of their mental state and how violent they were. And they didn't want them to be a fatality. So it's very, very crucial. And in Baltimore City, Mayor Scott has actually begun that process with getting mental health services, because I've seen them come into the court with people during normal court hours.
No, I mean, they're very crucial. And, I know the bill has not made much leeway in the state, but, they are very crucial, because the thought is every interaction doesn't need, an armed officer. And at the end of the day, the constituent, the resident, the people, they could benefit from this, treating it as a mental health response, instead of, an armed officer response. And then the thought is it frees up the officer's time to go, actually secure the community.
Yeah.
So it's very important. Okay,
I agree.
Okay. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you was, due to the lack of transparency in the judiciary, we don't really know most of the time of the impact of the judges that most of the time the impact the judges have on the society. So you talked about being on the bench for a while. What have you done?
20 years.
Yes, exactly. 20 years. What have you done in criminal justice in Maryland? As they continue to, because Maryland, we know, has a history of incarcerating Black people, more per capita than any other state. So what have you done to address that? And like, where do you fit in? What exactly can you give me there?
Well, Martin, the court system is open to the public. So the courtrooms are open as long as court is in session. If that's 8:30 at night, and I've had trials go that late, The court is open because it has to be by law, by the Constitution. The courts are open. Not only are the courts open whenever there's a hearing, because we are prohibited by law from closing the courtrooms to public, every single thing that a judge says about the case in the courtroom, which is where you have to sentence. You're not allowed to sentence anybody in your chambers. You're not allowed to examine witnesses outside of the courtroom. Everything happens in the courtroom, and it's all recorded. All of those recordings are available to anybody that wants them. And if you can't afford the transcript because you're indigent, there's a form that you fill out and you request it to have the transcript given to you for free, which I've signed plenty of those when people have come for court. Now, there's legislation currently pending when it comes to having cameras in the court, and year after year after year, that's been presented to the legislature, and it never has been passed. I'm not opposed to it as far as people being able to see what's happening in the courtroom. However, there is, especially, where I've tried cases in the city and the county, and I've actually sat in Harford County and Anne Arundel, there is a real fear of witnesses when they come to court without cameras in the courtroom. They're scared to death in many cases of retaliation, and they should be, because there have been plenty of retaliatory murders. So having the courtroom visual, I'm for, but making sure witnesses and victims' faces are not on the camera, and making sure that their voice is disguised, and any other identifying factors that would keep them safe. And I know that that's been the huge issue with the States Attorneys Association. It's hard enough to get witnesses to come in, especially in domestic violence cases. And I was a national leader in teaching judges about how to handle domestic violence cases. And for at least 10 years while I was a judge on the district court, I trained all of our new judges on best practices in domestic violence cases. And the domestic violence cases are really tough, Martin, because having the victim come in and testify about his or her loved one is a difficult challenge as it is, but also not knowing what to expect from the judiciary and from the judge or from the prosecuting office, and whether they're going to be further victimized by the system has always been a big hurdle in getting victims to come forward so that they are safe, because we've seen a huge increase in domestic murders over the pandemic, but it wasn't slowing down that much before. And I've been working as an advocate in this area for 30 years. I've traveled to Russia, I've traveled to Ukraine, went on a mission with federal and state judges to train on, domestic violence and domestic violence best practices. So it's not just a state problem, a national problem, it's an international problem. And when it comes to having, courtrooms open and visible, it's, recording it, fine. And even having people on, cameras in the courtroom, I'm fine with, but we have to make sure these victims and witnesses are safe.
Yes. Are we in favor of canceling no-knock warrants? And
they got canceled.
They didn't get canceled.
Right.
They didn't get canceled completely.
You're right. It has to be signed off. It used to be that you could come in as a detective and ask for a no-knock warrant, and you had to show there was some reasonable belief, reliable belief, that the person that they were having the warrant for had a firearm. Now what they have to do in order to get a no-knock warrant signed, is they have to have the state's attorney who's requesting it sign off on it first. And it has to only be during certain hours. So you can't have a no-knock warrant like they had in that horrible case with Breonna Taylor. You can't have a no-knock warrant at 3 a.m. It has to be between morning hours and early evening. So if there's some reason to believe that there's a firearm and you have in that warrant reliable information from the person, like a CI, a confidential informant, that says there are firearms there and, someone's life could be at risk if there was not a no-knock, then the ASA in charge of that case signs off on it, and a judge still has the discretion to deny it or to grant it, because they're very dangerous. So the legislature passed that last session in 2021.
Yes, hey, it's part of the story that I believe in Maryland is like, hey, we're somewhat progressive, but we don't go far enough. And that's just me being honest, because, as you said, yes, there's sometimes serious incidents and serious cases, But I'll be clear that there's sometimes where it's bad information, or just unintended consequences, collateral damage, right?
Right.
So that's just me being honest about it.
Well, no, you're not just honest about it. You're 100% correct. That you can never ever protect or guard against some bad actor putting fake information in a warrant. They have the gun trace task force, those, in Baltimore City. Can't tell you how many warrants that they presented to judges to have signed. And we all know now that a good portion of those were lies. So it's something that needs to be addressed and looked at. And, whenever I signed a warrant, I was very, very careful about it, because you can't just be knocking down people's doors. It's traumatic, and especially if there's children in the home. So, they're very, very serious tools that law enforcement has, and the judges take that very seriously. And I know I did as a judge.
Yes, yes. And one other question, because I've talked to many different states attorneys. Do you believe that juveniles are irredeemable? And yes, this is a loaded question. The reason I say this is because Scott Schellenberger, and I named him because we had the same conversation, and it was about juvenile life. I said that, I don't believe in juvenile life, and he presented some arguments in which he believed in juvenile life. Of course, I still don't believe that to this day. So what is your position on juvenile life?
Listen, these cases are all very, very different. I think right now in our juvenile justice system, juveniles do get an opportunity to have their sentence reviewed after a period of time, so that there essentially is an opportunity to review them. The cases in the juvenile justice system are actually, when a juvenile gets put into the juvenile justice system, the Attorney General has a juvenile justice system monitoring unit where the AG has to make sure that the Department of Juvenile Services is adequately caring for these kids. Because there's nothing more heartbreaking to me than to see kids locked up. It's nothing more heartbreaking to me to see a kid involved in a murder. I mean, you wonder how did that happen? And that's why for 12 years when I was in the court, district court, I volunteered as a truancy court judge in 4 different schools, so that I could sit down with kids and their parents and educators to resolve the issues that were going on, that were keeping a kid out of school. Because we all know, if you're in school and you have great mentors and you're learning and you're, getting confident and, building your education, there's nothing greater for a kid than that, and the love of their family or, friends. So the juvenile justice system always just tears at my heart. And I think right now there's a bill that is asking that the juvenile justice waiver system be flipped. I'm sure you're familiar with it, Martin, because right now there's
Yes.
certain crimes that if you commit them as a juvenile, you're automatically charged as an adult. And then your lawyer can ask that you be waived back to the juvenile system, but it's automatic charge as an adult. I think we need to flip that. We need to make it you're automatically charged as a juvenile, then you let the state request to have you be charged as an adult, and then you let a judge make the decision. And I think that's a really smart bill, and I hope that passes, because some of the factors that they're using is like the appearance of the juvenile. Well, you might be a 15 or 16-year-old kid and look like you're 20, but that doesn't mean, and I know because I've had kids, that doesn't mean that your frontal lobe has fully developed and you really understand the consequences of what you're doing. So it is really one of the most difficult scenarios when we're talking about juvenile justice, because you want to believe and hope and that there's redemption for kids, and at the same time you look at families who have lost loved ones as a result of a juvenile crime, and it's just these things have to be balanced, and each case is different. There aren't any two similar juveniles, so that's why I think when they're in the system, sadly, if they've been convicted of a serious crime like murder, that there be a period of time where there's a review, because people change, and we want, if someone's in the juvenile justice system, that if they're being rehabilitated. That's the whole purpose of it. Rehabilitated, giving them resources so they can get their GED, giving them resources so they can learn a skill, so that their mental health is being addressed. All of these things need to be happening when we put kids in jail.
Absolutely. And of course, we've had a very in-depth conversation. I appreciate it. So on a more lighter scale, are you a Pepsi or Coke type person?
Diet Coke all the way.
Diet Coke, okay.
Mhm.
Um, so it's still Women's History Month. Who's your women's history idol? Who are you looking up to?
Wow, that's a good one. Number one is my mom. She went to law school and then she had to drop out because she didn't have to, but she got married, and back in the 50s, that's what you did. So my mom, and then my grandmom, because she was working during the Depression, and even though she was married, she was not allowed to say she was married or she'd lose her job. But she was a strong math student and she was an accountant with Maryland Casualty Company. So I had these great, strong women in my background that I'm very, very proud of. And again, certainly, I got to tell you, our new nominee to be the next Supreme Court justice just is such a trailblazer. And I'm so proud of how she handled herself. So I'm really looking forward to having Justice Jackson on the bench.
Yes, you're 100% right. What is your favorite Maryland event? Annual
Well,
event?
gosh,
Yes,
I'd
I
have
know.
to
And
say my
and
favorite.
nobody else is gonna feel jealous.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not Preakness because there's way too many people there. Um, my favorite
Maybe more
Maryland.
exclusive. Maybe an exclusive one. Who knows, right?
I don't do anything exclusive. I'm trying to think. My favorite Maryland event. It's definitely, it used to be the Flower Mart. When we had in Baltimore City, we had the Flower Mart, but it feels like since the last 2.5 years, we haven't really had
Yeah.
any great spring events. So I'd have to say, historically, it's been the Flower Mart in Baltimore City, where everybody gets together and there's great flowers to buy, and there's kids from all the different public schools performing, and you have some, lemon. Have you ever had this, Martin? It's, you take a half a lemon and you put a peppermint stick in it.
Yeah.
Maybe it's, yeah. So anyway, they sell those. So yeah, I have to think, I'm really aching for spring now. So it would have to be Flower Mart, and I'm hoping that we're
Huh.
having it again this year.
Well, awesome. I got to check out that event myself. And I'll do you one better. You got to come down to Laurel. We have Main Street Festival happening, and the Fourth of July Festival. So I would say those are two historic events. Themselves. So definitely check
Right.
them out.
Do you guys have parades?
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. I think last
I think
year
I've
we
been in
had
them.
a few candidates and stuff at the parade. So definitely come on through.
I would love to. Thanks, Martin. It's been great hanging out here and talking to you.
Yes, and so tell people how they can stay connected with you. Of course, we got some time until the elections, but yeah,
We have a lot of time until the election, so I'm really happy about that because it gives me much more of an opportunity to get all around the state and talk about why the Attorney General's office is so important to voters. It's just as equally as important as the governor's office because, like I said, it's chief legal officer for the state, protecting Marylanders from consumer fraud, our environment right now. We've all seen the extreme weather events that have affected not only the nation, sadly, just last week, the tornado in New Orleans, but also our great state. We have had extreme weather events, and it's not going to get better unless we have an attorney general that fights for environmental justice and has the experience to do that as a strong advocate, as a strong lawyer who's had those skills in the courtroom. I'm excited about other areas in the AG's office as well, joining in with other states to protect Maryland, like Attorney General Frost did with the opioid crisis. And my father, who was Attorney General many years ago, actually led the litigation against or the fight against the tobacco industry so that they stopped selling tobacco products. Well, not stopped selling them, but stopped advertising tobacco products to kids, to teens, and making it sound as though tobacco wasn't as dangerous as we all know that it is today. And that's why that was a huge settlement. So that's still giving money to Marylanders, as will the settlement with the opioid crisis. So it's a really important job, and it's for someone who seriously just wants to be Attorney General. I'm talking about the rule of law, not the rule of politics here. So if you want to get involved with the campaign, I would hope you would reach out. We are a Katie4MD. That's KATIEFORMD.com. Just feel free to ask for a lawn sign, a bumper sticker, or a volunteer. We could use your help, and I look forward to being in your county to meet and greet with you, hopefully in person, Martin.
yes, I look forward to it, and you enjoy the rest of your week for sure, and I appreciate you for coming on.
No, it's my pleasure. Take care.
Yes, and we have a very special guest coming up. One of my favorite people in the cannabis community. Hey, what is going on, Doc?
What is going on, Councilman? Such an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, yes. Thank you for being on, and of course, I hope everything is going well with you.
Always
Yes,
living the life in Silver Spring. I
of
couldn't, I
course.
couldn't, I couldn't love starting the day any better than with you on this podcast. I mean, again, such an honor, and thank you for that warm welcome.
Oh, of course. And so I will say there's some people who might not know who you are, right? So I think you have to tell them, what you do and how amazing you are. I think you just gotta let them know.
So you're such a flatterer. I appreciate you. I am a physician, one of the 90% of physicians in the United States that is not taught about cannabis. I wasn't taught about cannabis not because it does not have thousands of medicinal values for people across the world, but because of the systemic racism that occurred in the 30s in the United States because of the so-called war on drugs. It's for that reason that cannabis was removed from the United States pharmacopoeia and is no longer available as a treatment for a variety of disorders. So I always say not only am I a physician, number one, which is what I went to school and acquired all my student loans for, but in order to really be pro-medical and adult use cannabis, it's imperative that you're a historian, you're an activist, you're involved in policy, you're involved in medicine, you really understand why it is that we are where we are today. So I currently work for Goodness Growth Holdings, which is the only physician-led cannabis company in the country. We have a robust clinical research portfolio, which again is very rare because of the federal illegality and Schedule I status of cannabis. It's virtually impossible to perform that gold standard of research. So we're really dedicating ourselves to bringing that research, which is kind of the common tongue between doctors, so that we're able to discuss it, and doctors can no longer say, I wasn't taught about this in medical school, so I'm not going to recommend it to my patients. No, let me give you this stack of research, research that's been going on internationally for 50 years, and research that we're doing here in the United States that is showing, conclusively that cannabis really can be beneficial to many different patient populations.
Yeah, I mean, you impacted so many things in there. So I'll start with the first one. Of course, we are doing more research on cannabis science, but it's definitely a misnomer that we haven't known the medical effects for decades now. Of course, as you know, what is it, the 1944 LaGuardia report, that came out that basically, dispelled a lot of the myths, and talked about a lot of the medicinal positives, that we talk about. So I mean, of course, in that aspect, and one of the things I know, I saw a post from you recently, you kind of brought it up in your speech, but it was about that. It was kind of like shame on like medical universities or something for like not teaching cannabis. It was something like that, and I was like, yeah, right on,
Right.
something along that, right? Like,
I mean, cannabis, the people, the healthcare providers that are recommending cannabis are just getting into cannabis. It's kind of as a last resort, right? So these are conditions that are called intractable pain, intractable fill in the blank, which means that they basically tossed every single agent pharmaceutical at this condition, pain being a huge one, and it's not working. So as a last resort, they're going to cannabis as a treatment for pain, which is completely, counterintuitive and backwards when you think about side effect profiles. Cannabis should be the first treatment. It is virtually impossible to die from smoking or ingesting too much cannabis. And then we compare that if we're using pain as the model, where people take NSAIDs like candy, take, Aleve. If you're in pain, you're not going to take one or two Aleve. You're popping them like candy. And that's incredibly detrimental to the aging kidneys, to the heart. Acetaminophen is detrimental to the liver. And then when you compare that to cannabis, which of course comes with its own side effects, but it's so much more gentler on the body. It should be the first line treatment for so many different conditions. And because we don't have that education, we don't have that research, doctors are, unfamiliar with the plant and therefore don't want to give it to their patients. They still have this horrible stereotype of people that are using cannabis, right? It's this hippie with a tie-dyed shirt, it's a criminal, and it's unacceptable. It's 2022. We're in the midst of an opioid crisis. I mean, how many more people, Americans, really need to suffer before we understand that this is a plant that's been around medicinally since, 2400 BC. It's only a recent history that it's really been demonized.
No, you're right. It's been around since the dinosaur age, right? The dinosaurs was eating these plants, of course. That's why they call them weeds. They don't need much care to grow. But the more care you put into them, the better quality weed you're gonna get, right? So, but you brought up so many things I wanted to hit on. The first thing you brought up is, there's different myths to dispel, and I think that, me as the cannabis councilman, right? So, the thought is there's different myths to dispel, and one of the things I always try to tell people is there's many different ways to consume, because a lot of people just really think of edibles sometimes, and a lot of people just think of combustibles, which would be the dabs or the smoking, but there's bombs, there's tinctures. I think I've even seen like the psychoactive food flakes. So there's so many different ways to consume, and it doesn't even have to be psychoactive, right? You can do more hemp CBD. If you're trying to really sleep, do the CBG route. So there's many different ways to consume, and I think that's part of dispelling the myth is kind of letting people know this, because for my grandmother and people of that age group, I feel like CBD is a thing to wean them on to medical cannabis or medical marijuana, and the reason that is because they become familiar with the plant, and then they realize, okay, I don't get this euphoria or this psychoactive feeling or whatever, so I like this, but I get this pain relief, and I take a few less opioids. Wow, what a win! Because as we know, opioid use is up like crazy. I think 30%. And the thought is like, we need to make medical available. We need to have responsible adult use programs. We need to also just really invest in mental health, right? So that's one of the things that I was talking about to someone earlier, is like, we need to have mobile crisis units everywhere, because they would treat these mental health crises and these drug and substance abuse issues as just as those issues. They wouldn't criminalize them. So you brought up so much, but I definitely just wanted to give you props on bringing up the consumption and canceling the stigma.
And a forum like this is how we begin to cancel the stigma. And I'm so happy you brought up mental health, which is another incredibly stigmatized issue, which should not be a stigmatized issue, right? Sure. If you have high blood pressure, you don't have to talk about it behind closed doors. You can disclose it to your employer. And now more than ever, we need to talk about mental health, and we need to talk about mental health in the context of non-traditional treatments. There have been studies now, we're about to see an epidemic on top of an epidemic with regard to new onset mental health conditions, right? There are studies that are coming out that are showing that 60%, upwards of 60% of people that had COVID have a new onset mental health illness, meaning that before they had COVID, they did not meet the diagnostic criteria to have a mental health disease. And I'm talking mostly anxiety, depression. And again, we're throwing, as mental health practitioners, psychiatrists, even general practitioners are throwing these SSRIs, these benzodiazepines, which work for a lot of people, right? I'm not going to say that they don't, because they absolutely do, but they don't work for everyone. Benzodiazepines have a high potential for abuse, high potential for addiction. SSRIs have their own discontinuation syndrome, meaning it's dangerous to stop taking them.
Sure.
And we have research, again, not in the United States because of the Schedule 1 status. We have the research that shows that certain formulations, cannabidiol, great, works so well for generalized anxiety disorder and many different anxiety disorders under that umbrella. You know, there hasn't been as much research on depression, but we talk anxiety, we talk PTSD, we've shown that it's completely efficacious in treating those symptoms. And again, what a disservice to your patients that you are not able to have that in your medical toolkit to really help your patients and not just throw these potentially very harming single agent pharmaceuticals at them. So thank you for bringing mental health. We need to do that.
I feel like you brought up so many things. For one, we need to promote holistic alternatives, you know, treatments to these prescription pills, these, you know, opioids. Of course, you know, one of the things that I mentioned with the last guest was that, you know, there's a multi-state lawsuit against pharmaceutical companies because, as we know, a lot of these pharmaceutical companies, a lot of these politicians, you know, they were complicit, you know, doctors, they were all complicit, you know, in the market. And the thought is like, we know why it was prohibited in the first place, right? It was due to hemp. It was due to hemp and the fact that hemp has 1,000+ uses, in which America is still behind on. You know, so the thought is like, I'm a proponent of like, the plant should have never been illegal in the first place, prohibited. But I'm also a proponent of like, I'm a proponent of a medical, but I also believe in therapeutic and recreational use, right? Like, as you were mentioning, mental health, right? So, you know, I also commonly believe in that. And outside of that, I think to some extent, even self-medicating, right? Because like, you know, long before, you know, I was a medical patient, I believe like, you know, cannabis use helped me with my neurodivergency issues. You know, so the thought is like, you know, my mind a lot of times was always racing with ADHD and just multiple thoughts. So like, you know, usage actually helped like slow those thoughts down and, you know, being able to like focus and, you know, if I get laser focused, you know, no telling what could happen. You know, so yeah.
No, but and thank you for being candid and outspoken about that, because there's so many people that share that similar story that have found that, you know, their own personal use has really helped them with different neurodivergencies. ADHD being a huge one, but again, because ADHD is not a qualifying condition in most states, because there isn't that research, and of course, because of the stigma, people are ashamed to speak out on that. But yet we have this, there's no stigma involved with the amphetamines that are overprescribed to pediatric patients for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So again, completely counterintuitive, right? If you're a parent, you know, you're a parent, do you want to put your child on, you know, a potentially addictive stimulant that can really alter their mood, their eating, their social interaction, versus something that may be, you know, less detrimental psychologically and long-term to your children? I mean, again, it's going to be completely different based on everyone's individual central nervous system, right? But why would you have that option when we've seen, you know, anecdotally, research-based, that this has been incredibly beneficial to people with many different types of ailments? We're talking mental health right now, but tell me another drug out there that can treat chronic pain, ADHD, you know, a variety of other multiple sclerosis.
It's a neuroprotectant as well, right? It's a neuroprotectant.
Yes.
So
CBD has been studied a lot to have neuroprotective properties. You know, again, I hate saying this because I say it all the time, but we need more research. We really do. That's the only way we're gonna be able to really speak to doctors and really put policy forward that really changes this backwards 100 years that we've been experiencing, right? Like, there's no other way at this point. And again, we can't do research because it's this, you know, horrible cycle. We can't do research, so we can't get the information to people. And then the stigma attached is it doesn't allow us to deschedule it because there's no research. So, you know, you're in between a rock and a hard place at that point. And again, the only people that were hurting are the millions of Americans that are going to have chronic pain, new onset mental illness, and a bevy of other symptoms related to long COVID, right? Including people that absolutely are going to need those neuroprotective properties that have been studied, not vastly, but enough that it should be available to people from a scientific perspective at this point.
What and you know, you brought up cannabis and COVID. You know, like if you know anything, talk a little bit about, you know, I think there's a study about cannabis usage and COVID, and I was promoting, hey, cannabis. You know, you see the correlation, right? Cannabis usage lower COVID rate. So, you know, explain that. I don't know if you saw the study.
Of course. I mean, don't get mad at me, but I really don't like that study because I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. I know. That study was done in vitro. So it was done in a lab and a test tube, which I never think is clinically applicable. And it was done, and it's still amazing that it got this much press, right? Because when does cannabis research get press like that? But I had some friends call me and saying, oh, if I smoke this joint, am I not going to get COVID? And unfortunately, no. And I said, the only way that it will prevent you, that cannabis will prevent you from getting COVID, is if you have a good indica strain and it makes you, couch locked and you're not going to leave the house and be exposed. But unfortunately, no, those acidic cannabinoids are not found when you smoke, right? That's before they're decarboxylated, CBDA and CBGA, which were the two acidic cannabinoids in that study. However, they are a bioavailable, meaning they have a physiological effect on the body if they're taken in, a tincture form in a way that you can really ingest them, not smoking. Right when you light that on fire, it takes away that acid and becomes our CBD and CBG that we're more familiar with. So again, a great start. And I don't like to poo-poo any cannabis research because, again, it's amazing. But that article in particular was not as exciting as I think the headlines are making it out to be. There are some studies that have always shown that cannabidiol, specifically CBD, right, is very great at working with our immune system. We have cannabinoid receptors on, our immune cells, our white blood cells, our spleen. So a lot of times what they've been studying, again, not in human models, but that it blocks that cytokine storm, which is the body's reaction to a new virus or something along those lines. So again, my favorite thing to say, we need to study it more in humans so that we can make clinical inferences from the research. I'm sorry to burst your bubble, though.
Hello?
Hey.
Oh, yes.
How about now?
Jeez. Yes,
Welcome.
we're good. Man, that sucked. Today has been the craziest day of errors, but Murphy's Law, what can go wrong will go wrong.
I know.
Right? So
it's 2022.
yes. So we were talking about the study, and I think you were bringing up another point. But anywho, the fact that you were saying we need more cannabis research. I love the Connor Sheffield Foundation. Of course, I think they have a great thing going over there, and I think what all their proceeds are going towards cannabis research. And I found that Connor was a great person, and of course, in advocating for himself, he was also advocating for many other people, right? And because when he brought attention to it, his issue, it made me aware that this was even a thing, right? Like the fact that as a pediatric medical patient, you weren't able to, your parents or the nurse wasn't able to administer, your medical cannabis. And of course, as I told people a lot of times, when they were thinking about it, it's not as if it's like a combustible. It's probably in a pill form or a tincture, especially given that it's a pediatric and at school. But it was very inconvenient for the parent because the parents, they have to go then up to the school, take the kid off of school grounds, administer it to them, then bring them back. So, it's very difficult for the parent, to even live a regular life, and just nerve-wracking in the first place. But then it's too just also the stigma. So, passing that legislation Connor's law, Connor's courage. It also, helps cancel the stigma of like, it's something very bad that can't be done at school, and has to be done in the dark shadows. I kind of brought that up, but when you were talking about the research, I thought that was an awesome point.
Absolutely, and huge fan of the Sheffield Foundation. I mean, Trisha is a true advocate. I've seen her speak so many times, and never not inspired by her. And that's just a perfect example of how you have to really be an advocate, a policy influencer, a scientist, and really to be heard, right? Just, doctors are only going to listen to doctors. Politicians are only going to listen to other politicians. It's just how it is right now. And it's unfortunate because we see firsthand how many people are really benefiting from this plant. We keep talking about, opiates and how important and relevant cannabinoid-based medicine is for opiates. There's something that occurs that it's called synergistic analgesia. So there are particular patient populations that need opiates, right? Those are post-surgical patients. Those are end-of-life care patients. In cannabis, synergistic analgesia means that cannabis works alongside with opiates. So it really, and synergistically, so it increases the effects of opiates. So when you use cannabis, you need less opiates to achieve that pain relief. So think about how amazing that is, right? You don't need that high of a dose, which isn't going to put you into respiratory depression. It's going to make you more aware at the end of life when you're using cannabis. So again, these pain doctors don't want to give their patients opiates anymore. So when they're really learning about that biomolecular, ability that cannabis has in conjunction with opiates, they want to give that to their patients. Again, this is some of the research that we're doing right now with Albert Einstein College of Medicine. We have a $3.8 million NIH grant for opioid reduction in chronic pain patients with the use of our medical cannabis products. And, the first one that we're doing is observational, just really showing as an intervention how it's working to reduce that. But again, we're bringing that medicine to patients in the Bronx, which is a medically designated as a medically underserved area. In opioid addiction, opioid prescriptions are rampant there, but unfortunately, particular populations aren't able to afford those medical cannabis products. So we're giving them the free $1 bottle of cannabis-based medicine to really reduce that harm that's caused by the opiates. And because they're in soft gel form, this brings me back to what you were talking about, right? That stigma of people assuming that when you're ingesting cannabis, the only way you're really doing it is dabbing or taking a bong, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But we're talking about true medical forms. We're talking about soft gels here, right? We're talking about tablets, sprays, suppositories. I mean, there's so many medically non-stigmatized ways that people can really ingest that. And once physicians are aware of that, once researchers are aware of that, it really breaks down those barriers. Again, we're not talking Cheech and Chong here. We're talking true pediatric medicine. We're talking true harm reduction with regard to opioids medicine. And, unfortunately, we have to sing this from the rafters all the time, right? In order to get people to start talking about it and not laughing. When I started in the cannabis industry years ago, and I told my medical school colleagues, they were giggling and laughing and, didn't want to like my posts on LinkedIn because they didn't want to be associated with someone in the cannabis industry. And unfortunately, that's not abnormal. And I'm sure you've experienced similar situations in your career.
Sure. The thought is like, I really don't care. You can care less, right? But the thought is I have realized long time ago that people are treated unfairly because of the plant. But I just realized long ago that if we actually put the negative, all the negative connotations aside, we could actually then figure out how magical this plant absolutely can be, right? Because I feel like each year and each month we find out more about it, right? So just living and learning with the plant. We're learning so much more, about what it can do, and for one, I've seen the different economic benefit, right? I've seen several states, benefit economically, where they're giving money back to the cities now. They already gave back to the state, went back to the counties. So now it's trickling down to the cities. So I am really looking forward to the future of cannabis. But one of the things that I went to a grow dispensary and someone said to me is, he said the terps or the medicine is in the terps. So for someone who is a layman person, just explain what terpenes are.
We love terpenes. So when we talk about different molecules in the plants, we talk about cannabinoids, which we're familiar with, right? Which we've been discussing, our CBD, our THC, and those are specific. It's an excellent question about terpenes, because we didn't use, until recently, we weren't really discussing the clinical value and the medicinal value of terpenes. They're kind of these ancillary molecules in the cannabis plant, when in fact, we've started studying them clinically in the past few years. And if in the cannabis plant, I should say, these are molecules that are not specific to the cannabis plant. We compare those to cannabinoids, which we've already discussed, which are specific to the cannabis plant. It includes our two all-stars, CBD or cannabidiol, and THC. Terpenes are very, very much present in the cannabis plant, but we also see them in many other botanicals throughout history. My favorites that I always talk about are linalool. Linalool is lavender. We've been using lavender as essential oils on our pillows for years and years and years. It has that calming effect. There are many cannabis strains that are high in a terpene called myrcene, which is also found in mangoes. There are many different other terpenes, and that's actually how we get that pungent smell of cannabis, is through those terpenes. We have different terpenes that are in black pepper, in different fruits. And again, all of these terpenes are now being studied to have their own medicinal value, anywhere ranging from anti-inflammatory to antibacterial. But I'll say it again, the research out there is not the best. It's not clinical, but again, patients, self-reported real-world evidence from the patients that we're seeing, they all have a particular terpene that helps them with their condition. And there's really no better evidence like that. As a doctor, if you're seeing a patient benefit from a particular strain and a particular terpene, there's nothing better.
Yes, right on. The terps, the medicine is in the terps. Like for me, learning about terps was completely mind-blowing, because as someone who used personally, it was just, give me that high THC count. I want the highest, but then you became a medical patient and you learned that, like, okay, you don't need always high THC count, right? Like there's benefits in these different terpenes, and some of the actually lower testing ones have some great terp profiles. So I feel like one of my favorite terps would be limonene. And that's because it helps with like focus and so I feel like that would definitely be probably one of my favorite. And I love Colorado, but that was one of the sad things about Colorado, is that they didn't have the the terp profile on the packaging. So
we have to go to Colorado. We have to go do a podcast in Colorado and tell them about terpenes. Apparently,
we most definitely do. We most definitely do. And of course, I'm sure we're going to do a lot of great work together, in the future. I'm glad to, have connected with you in 2022. You're definitely one of the cannabis all-stars I met, for sure. Yes. Yeah. And so before I get you out of here, 3 quick questions. What is your favorite, Pepsi or Coke?
Coffee.
Coffee. Okay, coffee beans. I got you. Still Women's History Month. Who are you looking up to?
Oh my gosh, Ketanji Brown Jackson. She's on the board of the high school I went to, Georgetown Day School, which is what she was being eviscerated by Ted Cruz about the other day, being on that board. Her kids go there, and just that is a class act. And as a woman, I strive to be like her. Since we're doing current events, Madeleine Albright. I mean, these are women that are really paving the way, and so much respect. and I can't even believe that I live, in the same city that they do.
I would completely agree with you. I would completely agree with you. And the last question I would ask you, what is your favorite Maryland event?
Oh, so I grew up in DC. So
You grew up in
I'm not going
DC.
to age myself, but when I was growing up, we didn't have the Nationals. Okay, so we used to go to Camden
Okay.
all the time, and any Orioles game, it's just home to me.
Ah, okay, yes, absolutely. I definitely love a good Orioles game. So, I appreciate it. And that's about it. But of course, I would love to have you back and continue to do great things for the cannabis community, the cannabis science community, and to just keep being an awesome person.
Appreciate you, and thank you so much for having me on today. Looking forward to doing some more good work together in the state.
Yes, we're gonna help out with the expungements. We're gonna make this happen.
Let's go.
Yes, I appreciate you. Thank you. Thanks. This was this week's episode 8. Join us next week.